President Biden finally delivers a major foreign policy address. Hello, welcome to Dangerous Policy, a channel aimed at intelligent people wanting to discuss important issues facing life and society. My name is Crispin, and today I'm going to give a review of a foreign policy speech President Biden delivered to the US State Department, where he outlined his administration's foreign policy priorities and objectives. A few kind of first impressions right off the bat. Number one, it was incredibly reminiscent of Barack Obama's so-called apology tour. When Obama was elected, he went through Europe, he went through the Middle East, delivering major foreign policy addresses, one in particular in Cairo, hosted by President Mubarak. This was right before the Arab Spring that completely upended that region, in which he essentially walked back all of the things that had happened under the Bush years. And Biden did this as well, just in a much kind of more compressed time frame, where he was clearly critical of the Trump administration. And the difference, I think, between the two is Obama's criticisms of Bush were fair. He probably wasn't very wise in the way he went about them. He really upset Israel. But the main criticisms were legitimate. Certainly, George W. Bush, his invasion of Iraq was the single greatest foreign policy catastrophe that America has faced since Vietnam. It cost trillions of dollars, thousands of lives. If you watch my previous video on America's relationship with Iran, you'll know that the principal beneficiary of that conflict was Iran. And meanwhile, as China was rising to challenge American hegemony in the Western Pacific, the Americans were completely focused, utterly distracted in a region of tertiary importance to its long-term national interests. So George W. Bush was a disastrous president, whereas President Trump, he is being treated quite unfairly, both by the Democratic Party, but also, I think, by early historians. First of all, President Trump is the only president in decades not to have started any new major wars. He destroyed ISIS. They had peace erupting across the Middle East under his administration, deals between the UAE, Sudan, Morocco, with Israel, and also increasing warming ties between Israel and Saudi Arabia. So all of this happened under the Trump years. And beyond that, Trump also took an America First foreign policy, which I think is much more aligned to the needs and desires of the American working class, who don't want to see global adventurism, wants other countries who have tremendous wealth to be able to look after their own national security, namely Germany. We'll come back to that. And also to work with like-minded countries, not just in terms of shared values of democracy and peace and stability, but just in national security interests. And that also includes places like Syria, where you might work with Russia, and also to focus laser-like on the main foreign policy challenge of the United States, which is China. And if there's one foreign policy kind of achievement that Donald Trump has as a true legacy, that is, for the first time, both sides of American politics are focused on Beijing as the primary strategic competitor of the United States. And that was really Donald Trump's doing. Barack Obama attempted to and then abandoned his pivot to Asia, whereas Donald Trump actually saw that through. So that was a great achievement on his part. And I think that on the foreign policy platform, Donald Trump achieved truly great things. North Korea hasn't tested a long-range nuclear device or a long-range ICBM in 3.5 years. So Trump has ticked a lot of successful boxes. However, the perception of Trump's kind of belligerence on Twitter, the churn, which was a legitimate criticism, the churn within the White House, the chaos of his administration, the inability to surround himself with people that were both capable and shared his vision. A couple of exceptions, like Richard Grenell, who was his acting national security advisor, also the first openly gay secretary level position to be sworn in, cabinet position. All of that happened under the Trump years. And yet Biden really kind of tries to wash that away. He says that, America's democracy and diplomacy and all of that was totally scandalized by the Trump years, and that, American moral leadership is back. And that was the kind of message, the core message that he was trying to deliver. And I thought pretty unpersuasively, given how divided the United States is. And in many ways, the speech that he gave was highly partisan in a domestic sense. So he's talking a lot about, so-called racial justice, intersectionality, critical race theory that's going to be implemented all across America's government. That isn't a sign that America is assuming moral leadership in the world, but rather that America is in deep end of empire territory with a lack of self-confidence in its own values and traditions, which it seeks to replace with this kind of neo-racialized ideology wherein, straight white males are at the bottom of some horrible new hierarchy. I think this is just a truly devastating area that the US is going in, and President Biden, far from pulling back on all of that stuff, which is what people claimed is a moderate, he's going hell for leather for it. So that's just one kind of big ticket that's mentioned a lot in his speech. A lot of domestic pandering, if you like, a lot of dog whistles. There were, on the substance of his foreign policy speech, a lot of problems. Number one, North Korea isn't mentioned at all. So if you remember when President Trump was brought into office, the last conversation he had with the outgoing President Obama was Obama saying, look, this is your number one threat, your number one priority. We are on the trajectory of war as North Korea accelerates its nuclear testing. Well, Biden doesn't mention them at all. It's like a completely non-issue. So that's a real concerning point. The focus on Yemen is kind of low-hanging fruit. So President Biden is withdrawing support for the conflict in Yemen, not allowing any American personnel to support that conflict in any way, withdrawing all aid. I think that's, broadly aligned with what most Americans would want. They don't see Yemen as being a core national security interest to the United States, and that is likely the case. And there is a lot of human suffering going on there. So Biden was right to draw attention to that. But to bring it up kind of just almost first as his main thing just really seemed like a sideshow, very much speaking to a certain kind of area of his own democratic base. Of course, he talked about Myanmar and condemned the military coup by the junta imprisoning Aung San Suu Kyi and her cabinet. Of course, that is totally appropriate. We should be condemning that wholeheartedly. Although the gloss has really gone off Aung San Suu Kyi. She is not seen as this sort of democratic reform figure who is going to bring in all the ethnic minorities, the Karens, the Rohingyas. To the contrary, she leads a very ethnically dominant kind of government and was prosecuting quite seriously the persecution of the minorities within Myanmar. So it's not like she's this, wonderful Masonic figure like she was perceived to be when she had won the Nobel Prize the last time around. However, one person who is genuinely an amazing, transformative figure of our age, Alexei Navalny, the number one positive for President Biden is that he was very strong on the Alexei Navalny issue. He was very critical of Russia's treatment of him and the expectation of the United States and the international community that Alexei Navalny be released. That is definitely a big tick. I look forward to the substance that President Biden will put behind that, because when his Secretary of State, Lincoln, sort of tweeted out a comment on the Navalny thing, I was deeply underwhelmed. It was really generalities. platitudes. Someone had written it, really tried to be careful not to offend anybody. Certainly no hard-hitting explanation of what the consequences would be if anything happened to Navalny. Now, President Biden didn't outline consequences either, but he was much firmer on this issue. So I think he does care about it, and I hope that he sees that through. The issue of China, I have to say, was a bit of an embarrassment. On the one hand, he did acknowledge that China is America's greatest long-term competitor, but it went back very much to the pre-Trumpian years of basically not taking the China issue seriously. He said, look, if America has a fair trade relationship and the Chinese stop engaging in IP theft, the US and China should be able to get along, and the US will not have anything to fear from China going forward, because if America is playing on a level playing field, no one can possibly compete with it. Now, that is totally absurd. That is a nepenthe of illusion, the product of someone who has spent many, many decades of life in a country in which it was unthinkable that the United States would not be the most powerful country in the history of the world. Whereas in actual fact, if you go back to 2003, when Bush went into Iraq, America's economy was 8 times that of China's. In the 1980s, China's economy was about the same size as ours, Australia's, and yet it is many times that of the size of Australia today. It's almost eclipsing that of the United States just in that sort of 17-year, 18-year period since the invasion of Iraq. It's an extraordinary meteoric rise. And not only is China going to eclipse the United States, it's going to continue to power ahead. And unless America gets dead serious about the existential threat that China poses to America's place in the world, then it is going to be utterly eclipsed. And if I was watching President Biden's speech in the Politburo in Beijing, I'd be kind of rubbing my hands together going, Biden is way too slow, way too beyond his prime, far behind the 8 ball in terms of the real challenge that is going on here. And thus, one would expect, even putting aside all the dubious business relationships the Biden family has with China, even putting that aside, I would feel pretty confident in Beijing of being able to handle this administration quite easily. The other major change was that Biden has said, look, we're going to do a global review under Secretary of Defense Austin of all America's military posture around the world and ensure that the military will be aligned with its core strategic objectives. Now, on the face of it, I absolutely support that, because any objective review of American force posture would show it is hopelessly misaligned for the key challenge of the 21st century. However, in the same breath, he said, look, until such time as that review is completed, we are going to reverse our decision to pull troops out of Germany. Now, if there is one low-hanging fruit that is patently obvious, is that there should not be 35,000 American troops in Germany. Germany is a massive country, 80+ million people, first world nation, easily able to take care of its own national security. You should absolutely be doing so. One might question whether or not America might want to increase some deployments in Poland and the Baltic states to shore up their national security, but to keep them all in Germany is just patently silly. And the fact that Biden has reversed that in the breadth of announcing a review kind of makes me think that the review itself is a politicized tool to really change nothing at all. So it's a bit of an embarrassment and a deeply concerning missed opportunity. President Biden also made mention of the fact that American foreign policy should be promoting LGBTQI rights across the world. And Trump really needs the credit for this. And this is something that I don't think he'll ever get from a lot of people. But again, President Trump was the first to appoint an openly gay member as a cabinet level position in the United States, Richard Grenell. And he made as a key foreign policy priority the decriminalization of homosexuality around the world. There's like 8 or 9 countries where homosexuality will get you the death penalty, and another 40-odd countries where it's illegal. All of the countries are Islamic countries, of course, and thus, there was being tied to a lot of business arrangements, a lot of engagement, a lot of aid, was the expectation that the treatment of the gay community within these countries would improve. And so Trump made that very clear, and that was a flagship of his foreign policy. And I think Biden is moving into that space, trying to prevent any kind of Republican inroads into the gay vote that exists within the United States, because an objective appraisal would be much fairer to Trump, certainly more fair if you consider Biden's record in his 47 years in public life, where he was a sponsor of the Don't Ask, Don't Tell policy of the military. He really was concerned that gays shouldn't be serving in the military. And thus, Biden has a lot to make up for and a lot of history to bury. The other main kind of point about President Biden is that he's talking about allies being the most valuable tool of American foreign policy. And that's simply false. I mean, I don't know how it'd be any more gentle than that. America's allies freeload off the United States completely. If you look at the defense expenditure of NATO, it is an absolutely absurd joke. And it was President Trump who rightly pulled them up on it. And it wasn't even just President Trump. Even Barack Obama's administration, particularly the Robert Gates, the Secretary of Defense, Robert Gates was Secretary of Defense under both Bush and Obama, the only one to serve 2 opposing party administrations. He called the defense expenditure of European NATO an exercise of collective military irrelevancy. So there was a deep-seated contempt for the freeloading of European powers on American taxpayers to defend them. And Germany is the absolute poster child of that, where you've got tens of thousands of American troops and Germany spending, 1.3% of its GDP on military, something absolutely absurd. So certainly Europe is willing to defend itself to the last American, isn't really doing much on its own, with some notable exceptions: the Baltic states, Greece, surprisingly, the UK, which has certainly voted to leave the EU, a couple of others, but most are woefully underspent. And so the US allies are basically a liability. The biggest US ally liability in the world is South Korea. South Korea is never, ever going to back the United States against China. From South Korea's perspective, their alliance with the United States is for one reason and one reason only, and that's to deter North Korea. Something that in the 21st century, South Korea would be absolutely capable of doing on its own, doesn't need American support for that purpose. And yet any notion that the descendants of the Chosun are going to ally themselves against the mother country of their entire national cultural tradition would be unthinkable. And every attempt by the United States to push South Korea in that direction is destined for failure. If there's one country in the world that South Korea would go to war with, it would be America's main ally in that region, which is Japan. So there just isn't any hope in that regard. The ally, as I've just mentioned, that is useful for the United States is Japan. And it was the Japanese Prime Minister had a very good relationship. The former Japanese Prime Minister now had a very good relationship with President Trump. And that alliance will remain strong. It wasn't hurt during the Trump years. And the Japanese were very confident, very pleased and relieved that Trump had made standing up to China a key pillar of his foreign policy objectives. And I think the Japanese will be slightly nervous about Biden, who is, much more equivocal on that question. So that's a big issue. Of course, Australia was going to be allied no matter what. Prime Minister Scott Morrison had a great relationship with President Trump. And I'm sure Morrison will have a decent relationship with Biden, although they are on opposite ends of the political spectrum. There wasn't really much else to report in President Biden's speech. I mean, he made a lot of Yemen and he made a lot of Myanmar, and while they are issues for today, they don't outline the long-term strategy that you would expect from a major incoming administration looking to, chart its survival over the coming decades. It was much more accommodating in its sound towards China, although it did acknowledge China as a major principal competitor, and it was strong on the Navalny question, which I thank the president for. If there's anything else on this issue that comes up, I'll be sure to let you know, but I was kind of underwhelmed. It did seem like a lot of domestic pandering, a lot of partisanship, a lot of criticism of the previous administration, and a lot of kind of moving into the domestic critical race theory stuff that is deeply concerning in America, something I think that the US itself needs to defeat. That's my view. That's my review. Please leave your comments down below. Did you see the speech? Is there anything that I really missed? Anything that you would like to discuss? And otherwise, leave a like and subscribe if you haven't already. Consider sharing this video, and I'll see you next time. Thank you.